Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the iNACOL webinar, Realizing the Promise, Making Personalized Learning Accessible to All Learners. Just a couple reminders before we get started. You will see a chat window to your left, on the left side of your screen, and we encourage you throughout this webinar to participate, ask questions, and share your thoughts on the content that's being presented. We will have a Q&A at the end of the webinar, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Also, if you are on the phone, please make sure you've got your mute button on, and as well as if you are on the computer online audio, just make sure that that talk button is unchecked so that we don't hear any background noise. So before we get started introducing our presenters, I would like to invite everybody here to please introduce yourselves. We'd like to know a little bit about you, where you're from, and what your role is in the field of blended learning, online learning, personalized learning, competency education, working with students with disabilities, or whatever it is that you do. We'd like to know where you're coming from. And with that, let's introduce our speakers. I'm Maria Worthen. I'm Vice President of Federal and State Policy at iNACOL, where I lead our policy and advocacy work at the federal and state level. And I'm very pleased to have three fantastic panelists joining us today. I'll start with Ray Rose. Raymond Rose has been involved in online education since the mid-1990s. He helped envision, create, and administer the first virtual high school in the country and was an early proponent of ensuring access and equity in online learning. And then we have Lindsay Jones and Meghan Casey from the National Center for Learning Disabilities, or NCLD. Lindsay leads and Meghan works on the team that designs and implements NCLD's legislative strategy in Washington, D.C., aimed at advancing government policies that support success of individuals with learning and attention issues in school, at work, and in life. And they also develop advocacy campaigns and work closely with NCLD's grassroots network of committed parents. So thank you all for joining us today to share your expertise and insights on how we can ensure that all types of learners are included in personalized learning. Just want to go over our learning objectives for today. So today's webinar will address 4 main goals. And as you look at this list, I would love for you all to weigh in as to what it is that you most want to get out of this webinar today. You could just put 1, 2, 3, or 4, or all of the above in the chat box. So we'll talk about briefly what is personalized learning. And we'll talk about what the opportunities of personalized learning are for students with disabilities. We'll talk about the challenges in personalized learning for students with disabilities. And we'll present some recommendations on how we can address those challenges. So if you would just take 2 minutes to take a look at these outcomes and write down what it is that you're hoping to get out of it today. Great. Well, thank you all for weighing in on what you'd like to learn. And looks like we're pretty evenly split over a lot of these, especially on understanding the challenges and how we can address those challenges. So thank you. I'm just going to quickly say what we mean when we talk about personalized learning. So personalized learning is tailoring learning for each student's strengths, needs, and interests, including enabling student voice and choice in what, how, when, and where students learn, to provide flexibility and support to ensure mastery of the highest standards possible. And when we think about what personalized learning looks like for a student, there are 4 elements that we see. The first is learner profiles. So understanding where students are in their learning and really having assessment that figures out how we can best address those needs through personal learning paths. And personal learning paths could include multiple modalities and learning environments. And these could include face-to-face instruction, blended learning, online learning, community-based educational experiences. And we talk about blended and online learning quite a bit when we talk about personalized learning, but they're not the same thing. And that's because blended and online learning are an important driver of personalized learning. It's very hard to do this at scale without blended and online learning available for students, because it provides a flexible learning environment where students can learn at a flexible pace and go back and master competencies, master standards in the way that works best for them and that's most engaging. So those are some of the, at a very high level, the elements of individual mastery. Of personalized learning. And before we go over to our speakers, I just want to give a sense of the scope of the population that we're dealing with when we talk about meeting the needs of students with disabilities. According to the latest Department of Education data, 13% of children and youth ages 3 through 21 are receiving services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and that adds up to about 6.4 million students. So, and of course, schools, individual schools and districts, these percentages can be much higher or a little bit lower, but this is a significant portion of our student population, and if these kids are left out, we are leaving out more than 1 in 10 of our students. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay Jones and Meghan Casey from NCLD to talk about how we can make personalized learning accessible to all learners. Thanks, Lindsay and Meghan.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Maria. This is terrific. We're really excited to be here, and we're definitely excited to be talking about this at this time when we're right on the cusp of just some incredible work that's going on across the nation. I know everybody on this webinar is probably engaged in that work, and we want to make sure that when you have students with disabilities in your classrooms, that they're included and that we can work together to find ways to address the challenges and really take advantage of the opportunities. So as a part of that, NCLD received a grant from the Gates Foundation last year to do a year-long investigation of how could we do that? How could we identify opportunities and challenges that were involved with personalized learning systems. And today we're going to talk with you a little bit about our findings, which we'll be releasing really shortly. But we were able to talk with close to, I think, over 40 incredible educators and experts to get their best thinking about what we need to do to make sure we have students included, and we can figure out really great concrete ways to do that. Before we get into the exact recommendations, we want to talk about 3 overarching reasons that we have to identify recommendations for students with disabilities in personalized learning. First, We must avoid the practice of retrofitting. Retrofitting personalized learning to meet the needs of students with disabilities would mean we would go forward and devise these systems and then think, oh, gee, how is this going to work with John, who has a learning disability, in reading, or Joe, who is a student with autism? Is this going to be a system that can best meet their needs? Unfortunately, over the course of education, we have too often not immediately considered the needs of students with disabilities alongside the needs of others from the very beginning as we design these systems. When we wait to think about how the system can really make the most of the environment for a student with disability, if we wait to do that, we end up doing this practice of retrofitting, of typically having to work around the situation, having to use a waiver, having to give a different test, put the education in place in a different setting. We want to make sure that to the extent possible that doesn't happen, that students with disabilities are included from the very beginning in all of our conversations, which is why we're so excited to have this project and to be here today. And it is clear, I probably don't even need to tell anyone on this call, personalized learning is rapidly expanding. And it's interesting because it isn't something that's coming from federal law. It doesn't appear to be a top-down mandate or initiative. It is huge numbers of districts and schools and even states across the nation investing in this. So before 2015, personalized learning grants had been awarded to 30-plus districts and 40-plus schools across more than 20 states. We've seen this investment through the Gates Foundation, Next Generation Learning Challenge grants, also the U.S. Department of Education's Race to the Top program. So it's absolutely a terrific time for us to be talking about this. Finally, personalized learning means huge changes to the education of students with disabilities. And I think one thing that was critical in our analysis is that personalized learning means big changes to the education for all students, right? All students are going to change, are going to experience education in different ways. Educators are going to deliver it in different ways. But our goal is to make sure that we remain focused on, but how will this really impact students with disabilities, to make sure that they're not lost within these conversations. Meghan is going to go through a lot of different things that we've identified and very clear calls to action for those who are implementing personalized learning. But it's pretty clear that general educators will need to be better prepared. It's a huge demand on educators in the classroom about how they now become designers and facilitators of education for all of their students, and how they can use technology, what they need to be thinking about the accessibility of technology, and also they've got to be thinking about the new skills that personalized learning places or requires of students. For students with disabilities, many of whom have things we call executive functioning issues. Those are things that are attention disorders, they're organizational disorders, they're processing disorders. These are students with the cognitive abilities to reach very high standards and learn at the same rate and pace as their peers, but they need to have a lot of support to be able to actually take advantage of these systems. They need support about how they learn and the decision making they're going to have to engage with now that they are not currently required to do. We also think, the final thing I'll say is we also think personalized learning with its student-centered focus and its real focus on engagement of the student and their interest is incredibly wonderful for developing a critical skill for students with disabilities, which is self-advocacy skills. A person with a disability may have to ask a college, an employer, and others. They may have to ask for an accommodation. They may have to talk about their disability. They may have to know what they need to achieve. That is something we think is a huge opportunity in personalized learning for all students, but in particular for students with disabilities. So I'm going to hand it over to Meghan to get into the nitty-gritty, but thanks so much for having us here, and we're excited by this conversation.
Thanks, Lindsay. My name is Meghan Casey. I'm the Policy Associate here at NCLD. Happy to be joining all of you today. And as Lindsay said, personalized learning holds a huge amount of potential for students with disabilities. So even though we're here to talk about some of the challenges we're facing and address, how we can handle those, I want to be sure that we don't discredit the real benefit that personalized learning offers. Because when it's done right for students with disabilities, personalized learning can truly customize education to meet every child's needs. So it's just important that we think we're thoughtful about how we think about personalized learning so that students with disabilities are truly engaged and supported. So I want to start by sharing a few of the big takeaways we found when it comes to personalized learning and implementing it for students with disabilities. And the first is the alignment of existing systems with personalized learning so that these systems are really important to the success of students with disabilities. And the first one here is universal design for learning. And to put that pretty simply, UDL has to be a core component of any personalized learning system if it's really going to benefit students with disabilities. So for anyone who isn't familiar with UDL, UDL is a set of principles that are incorporated into the classroom so that every student has the opportunity to learn. And UDL addresses how information is presented to students, how students express what they know in the classroom, and how they interact and engage with the material that they're working on. And so these principles determine how teachers tailor instruction for every student, and it applies to all materials, all assessments, and all the instructional strategies that teachers use to ensure that we really are tailoring the student's learning experience. So specifically for students with disabilities who have certain areas of strength and as well as certain areas that are a challenge for them, they may need to show what they know in a different way than other students in their classroom. And so UDL allows for these multiple ways to show what students know and to demonstrate mastery. It also provides more than one way for students to engage with their learning and receive information. So if you think about personalized learning, as Maria was mentioning earlier, students may have their own personal learning path, or they may demonstrate mastery in a different way than other students. And so to really incorporate UDL will allow students more than one way to demonstrate that mastery. And so this is really essential for students with disabilities. And UDL provides that foundation so that students with disabilities can really reap the benefits. And the second system here is multi-tiered systems of support, or known as MTSS. And so even when students can access the content and curriculum, often using UDL, they also need to receive the supports and interventions that they need to succeed. And MTSS is a framework that's used in schools around the country, maybe in your school, and this system allows educators to use data on students' performance to monitor their progress and make decisions, and then respond to students' academic and behavioral needs. So the core of MTSS is that educators are constantly gathering data and addressing student needs along this learning path and making changes as they go to truly meet the needs. So in a personalized learning system where students may be moving along a non-traditional path that's maybe not using seat time or credit hours, there has to be a way for schools to monitor student progress and ensure that students really are staying on track. And so we need to have safeguards. Without safeguards to ensure that kids are on track, it's too easy to allow our struggling students to move at a slower pace and over time potentially even fall way behind their peers. And so MTSS is a really important framework when it comes to progress monitoring, and it has to be incorporated into personalized learning if we're going to hold students to high standards. So those are the first two systems that are really important to think about as you're implementing personalized learning for students with disabilities. The second really big area that I want to mention is educator support and training, because as Lindsay mentioned, the role of an educator is really going to change in the classroom when we implement personalized learning. And specifically when it comes to students with disabilities, they're going to have to know a whole lot more about the issues and challenges facing students with disabilities and how to address those needs in their classroom. So they're going to have to know how to effectively instruct students along the whole range of disabilities, along the whole spectrum. They're going to need to understand executive functioning, as Lindsay mentioned, because personalized learning requires so much more from students in terms of decision-making, planning ahead, and organization. And these executive functioning can be a real challenge for students with disabilities. And finally, personalized learning is going to require students to understand how they learn and really take ownership of their learning and to become self-advocates. And so these are higher order skills that are so important to students with disabilities, as not only in school, but as they go through life. So personalized learning is a great opportunity to build on these skills, and students with disabilities will need that extra support from educators and instruction in this area. So these are all areas that educators are going to have to receive extra support and training on. And I think one important thing to remember is just as we're personalizing learning for students, we also need to be personalizing the professional development that we're providing to teachers. If we want teachers to truly be able to respond to the needs of every student, then schools need to respond to the needs of educators as well and provide professional development that is responsible to educator needs as well. And so when we're talking about benefits and challenges for students with disabilities, we've identified 5 benefits that we think are really important for students with disabilities. And again, personalized learning has so much potential to transform learning for all students, especially students with disabilities. And so, first of all, personalized learning changes the student's individual experience with learning. For so many students with disabilities, the focus throughout their education has been on their challenges, on the things that they can't do well or the things that they aren't given the opportunity to do. And so students with disabilities for so long have been defined by their limits. But personalized learning can really change that for a lot of students, because when instruction is tailored to meet student interests, they become much more engaged in their learning. When we focus on their strengths and what they can do and how they can succeed, they move from what we call a fixed mindset, where they're believing that they can't do certain things, to a more of a growth mindset. They know what conditions they need in order to succeed, and they're able to do a lot more. And so personalized learning offers students the chance to make these decisions on their own and get involved in their learning in a new way. But personalized learning not only changes the student experience, but also the school culture, which is very important for all students and students with disabilities. Because in a traditional environment, students who receive special education are often removed from the classroom in order to receive their special education services. But in personalized learning, it's not uncommon for all students to have one-on-one time with a teacher or to be working in a small group. So that type of instruction can become the norm for all students. And then it becomes less obvious which students are further behind or who are working on something a little bit different than other students. And that stigma that once accompanied special education can begin to disappear. And so this is a really huge shift for students with disabilities and a great benefit of personalized learning. And finally, to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to implementing personalized learning for students with disabilities. One of the biggest challenges is when it comes to monitoring pace and progress for students, especially in systems such as competency-based systems, where students may not be all on the same track or working on things at the same time. It becomes difficult to ensure that students with disabilities are maintaining a pace that will allow them to stay on track with their grade level or on pace to graduate with a regular diploma eventually. And so part of this issue is that we don't yet have a deep enough understanding of learner progressions, which are the particular sequence that student learning should follow for a student's particular development level, age, or grade level. And so there's a real challenge here when it comes to students with significant disabilities, and knowing what it is that they really need to know and be able to do in order to succeed, and then ensuring that we're providing them the right opportunities in the classroom to make that progress. And so student pace and progress and learner progressions have been a real challenge. And another one that comes along with personalized learning is accountability. Personalized learning systems must ensure equity for students with disabilities, and the assessments that we administer to students have to produce valid and reliable data, which can be difficult if students are working at different paces or tests are administered at a particular time in the year. So without really good data, it's hard to know how students with disabilities are performing compared to their peers, especially in systems where students are progressing at different paces. So these are all really important considerations to keep in mind as you're implementing these systems. And I think the next presenter is going to get a little bit more into technology. So I just want to mention that, as teachers begin to use more technology, we need to ensure that technology is not only appropriate for all students with disabilities, but is accessible for them as well. And then I want to get to the parent piece of this, because I think that's very important. One challenge that we've found has been that parents are really uninformed about what personalized learning is, and we need to do a better job of including them. As part of our work over the past year, we surveyed more than 1,000 parents to find out what exactly it was that they knew about personalized learning, and we quickly found out that only 40% of parents had ever heard of personalized learning. So then we decided to find out whether personalized learning is something that they wanted to know about. And it turns out that absolutely, yes, 95% of the parents that we interviewed or we surveyed wanted to know more about personalized learning. So clearly, parents are an untapped resource that should be brought in from the beginning as stakeholders in this whole process, not only because of the parents' deep involvement in the education of their child that has a disability, but because any successful reform is going to need to bring in parents at some point. And so I think that's an important thing to think about as you're implementing these systems. Have you brought parents to the table and really informed them about what's happening and brought them in as part of this process? So to wrap up, personalized learning can absolutely be successful for students with disabilities, and we're seeing it done well in many schools across the country. Some schools are doing really wonderful things. But students with disabilities have to be considered from the beginning of this process, and we need to see increased communication between all educators, administrators, and experts that are involved in personalized learning. And we need to continue to invest in research and shed light on the areas that we need to learn more, like we discussed a little bit about learner progressions, monitoring pace and progress, and assessment. So I will turn it back over to Maria.
Great. Megan and Lindsay, thank you so much. That was an excellent, excellent presentation. And once again, I would encourage the attendees today, if you have any questions or comments as you're listening to the presentations, please do submit questions. We will leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So at this point, I'm going to transition to our next speaker, who is Ray Rose. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Ray has dedicated quite a bit of his career to being an advocate for online learning and blended learning, and making sure that they are designed with equity in mind. And so to that end, I just want to talk quickly about how blended and online learning do relate to personalized learning. They are not the same thing, but blended and online learning are very important drivers for personalized learning. In order to do personalized learning at scale, we need to have platforms that allow us to assess students when they come in, assess them throughout the learning, and have that continuous improvement mindset to be able to offer flexible pacing, to be able to offer flexible learning environments. And so my question for Ray is, as he starts his presentation, is as important drivers of personalized learning, how can blended and online learning be designed with all learners in mind? So Ray, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Just to make it clear for folks, there is information at the end of my slides about where you can get my slides. They're on my website, and they are available on SlideShare. So, whoops, we just went too far here. The starting point here is that last year, working with Maria, I put together this publication for iNACOL, and this has far more detail. I noticed that we have a few people who are instructional designers, and I'm not going to cover the instructional design issues, but here's a resource for you to be able to get more detail on the design. I'm staying with the notion that we're dealing with leadership folks here. But first off, I'd like to say thank you for all of you that are here today. I recognize that for many of you, this is the first day of school. And I remember what it was like with the first day of school back 2 decades ago when we started the virtual high school. So the focus here is going to be much more on online learning, what the issues are for our digital access, and just a little bit of history, because this helps to frame the thing. These references here are school districts or colleges that have had an investigation by the Office for Civil Rights. And there are a couple of different ways that people get investigated by the Office for Civil Rights. The starting point is that somebody files a complaint. The other is that the Office for Civil Rights selects a school to go in and do an investigation. Now you notice that I've got both universities and K-12 institutions, and that's because in terms of the findings, when it comes to access in digital resources, online courses, the findings are all the same. It doesn't make any difference whether you're in higher ed or whether you're in K-12. If you are in a institution that receives federal money, you have to play the game by their rules. We're looking at 504, 508 legal piece, and this is civil rights legislation. And just a little bit of background, I have done civil rights enforcement for the Massachusetts Department of Education, and then I did a lot. I also developed compliance monitoring at the Massachusetts Department of Education, and have done a lot of professional development for school administrators, for school faculty on civil rights issues. Looking at what OCR has found, this is their definition for accessibility. And so this is the piece that you need to be aware of if you're looking at students getting access to digital resources. And it's real clear. Those with a disability are able to acquire the same information and engage in the same interactions is a critical piece, and within the same time frame as those without disabilities. So Lindsay and Meghan talked about the issue of don't try to retrofit materials to make them accessible for special needs. In fact, you have to be designing from the beginning and make sure that you're hitting all of these issues. So this is the starting point. Now what I want to do is just hit the policy pieces here, because we're supposed to be talking leadership. I wanted to make a focus on policy, and the big one, and I used to think I didn't have to talk about this, but your institution does not, by policy or practice, exclude students with disabilities from enrolling or participating in online learning activities. Just don't do it. The one that's more common, or more common than specifically excluding, is that the institution should not have a gateway exam or test where a specific score is required to participate in online learning activities. I will tell you that either of these will set you up for significant legal interaction. So when we're looking at schools, if you are in a public school, if you are receiving special needs students, if you're specifically excluding special needs students, and the issue that came up, and where I thought I wasn't going to have to deal with it, is in the previous one, where I was talking about doesn't by policy or practice exclude students. We've had school districts that have said if a student has an IEP, they can't come in. We're looking at a charter school situation where schools were saying, we don't accept students with disabilities. That's a violation. Sorry, folks. So here's another specific that your institution has designated a 504 coordinator. That's a requirement under Section 504. You also have to have a grievance policy that is designated as a 504 grievance policy, and you need to provide annual notification to all of the community who the 504 coordinator is, that you have a 504 grievance policy, that you don't discriminate on the basis of disabilities along with race, sex, national origin. So those are things. If you cannot find information about your 504 coordinator, and we're looking at the start of school this year, your institution has a problem. iNACOL has a set of quality standards, and iNACOL is the only organization around involved in online that makes those standards available free. Quality Matters has standards. It's a very expensive process to get involved with. Online Learning Consortium has standards, and that's expensive. All three organizations' standards talk about access as a requirement, but only the iNACOL standards are available for free. If you're not familiar with them, Maria will probably be good and put a link up, because I'm not going to quite get to it because of talking. But from an organizational perspective, from a liability perspective, you should have adopted a set of standards that are quality standards that include accessibility, and all of your courses adhere to those standards, which means you're reviewing them. And so you're reviewing your courses. If you are purchasing courses from an outside vendor, including profit or nonprofit vendors, you need to review them to make sure that they meet the legal accessibility standards. The vendors are not the ones that are going to get in trouble. They're not required to meet the 504, the 508 standards. Your institution is. So you're the one that has to do it. And that means understanding the policy too. And I can tell this story because these folks tell it. The Texas Virtual School Network has adopted as a requirement the iNACOL standards. And they review all courses to make sure that they comply with the iNACOL standards before they're allowed to be offered. And this goes back in history a number of years. But they were looking at them, and they were looking at the standards, and they said courses are accessible and allowed them. It took them about 2 years before they really understood what accessibility meant. And then they had to go back to vendors and tell them, I'm sorry, your course does not meet the accessibility requirements. You need to fix it. And it's a whole lot easier to deal with these things at the beginning and to make the courses accessible in design rather than going back and making sure and fixing something once you've started it. So all courses need to be reviewed, make sure they meet legal accessibility standards. If you've adopted the iNACOL standards, they need to meet the iNACOL standards. And you want to make sure that that's in place. And these are recommendations. You know, the first 3 are legal issues. These are my recommendations to make sure that you are in a good standing if you run into problems. If you've found courses that are not accessible, put together a process and a timeline for making them accessible. If for some reason OCR comes in and does an investigation, you're going to be a much better situation if you say, oh, we've identified these as problems, we're working to fix them, than if you say, oh, just look at all our stuff, here it is, and OCR comes in and cites you for lots of different violations. And then just for fun, it's not just your courses that need to be accessible. Your institutional website must be accessible as well. And this is a legal requirement on all of those, the history lesson, all those folks that were cited, every one of the institutions that OCR had a finding they cited the website as not being accessible. You want to have things that are serving students with special needs. They need to ensure the accessibility. Now, Lindsay and Meghan talked about getting access to the technology. And for me, it's much more about getting access to the content using the technology. You will find that many students with disabilities are using assorted assistive technology. And so the starting point is if they're looking at something online, they're using a piece of technology called a screen reader, which will take and read text which is appearing on the screen. That's fine, but if it's not text, it's graphics, then you've got to make the graphics accessible. And so there's a whole process, and I'm not going to go into all of that stuff. See the publication for the details. But for students with disabilities, they may be using some technologies to enable them to get access to content, but you've got to make sure that the content is accessible. And some students with disabilities don't have IEPs. But from the legal perspective, OCR, case law, all those, that little bit of history that I presented, and I didn't go back, but there are others before those. OCR says it doesn't make any difference whether you believe that there is a student with a disability in an online program, and that could be online or blended. Your material must be accessible. If you have digital resources, the digital resources need to be accessible. And from the university perspective, when I was at the university, the assumption was that you dealt with students that came into your class and you made your course accessible to them. But if you didn't have any students that had been identified as having a special need, you didn't have to do anything special. OCR says in an online situation, you have to. Lindsay and Meghan were pointing out, though not necessarily quite with the same legal piece, that you should be designing your courses, thinking about universal design for learning, understanding what that means, and putting universal design for learning into the courses as you go. So to have time to deal with questions, I'm just going to give you, my contact information. Slides are available at SlideShare under Raymond Rose, and at my blog, rmroseblogspot.com. And I will turn this back to Maria so that we can get into more of the questions.
Thank you so much, Ray. I always find when you talk about these the legal background and requirements, you make it so accessible to those of us who are not necessarily experts in the Supreme Court. I'm sorry, not the Supreme Court decisions, but the legal decisions and the department decisions. So thank you for sifting through all those complaints and analyzing what are the implications for educators. So at this point, before we go into the Q&A, I want to again invite you to please share your thoughts and questions in the chat. And I'm also curious to know, based on what you've heard today, what challenges do you see in your own work? How does this information relate to your own work? We want to hear from you. And we also want to know how you might apply these recommendations. Is any of this new information to you? Will it change how you do your job going forward? So at this point, I will move into the Q&A. And let me start with a general question for all of our participants, and then I'll go into some of the specific questions we've received from the audience. It seems that there's a lot of capacity that still needs to be built among educators, administrators, course designers, and product designers in the educational space in order to ensure that online and blended modalities are indeed accessible to all learners. So this question is for both Lindsay and Meghan as well as for Ray, is how can pre-service preparation and professional development better prepare educators to meet the needs of students with disabilities in personalized learning?
Hi, this is Lindsay. We'll jump in here. I think it's overwhelming, the capacity needs that are probably required of the teaching workforce. And so it's going to take both pre-service and professional development. Interestingly, one of the things that was raised in our investigation was that teachers need their own personalized professional development, meaning every year they're in classrooms with children who have different needs. And so if a general education teacher has a class one year with 5 students who have a math disability, they should have available to them some online professional development that will help them understand how they can differentiate their instruction to best provide access to the curriculum that to these students who have a math disability. But the next year, they may have students with with a different type of disability. So some of the professional development that needs to be created and offered by districts has to be offered on demand and in a personalized way. I think that's a great area for a lot of, hopefully, vendors to explore. I think in terms of pre-service, it was pretty clear from our investigation that most universities around the nation are not considering personalized learning at all. They've not included it in a deep or rich way within their pre-service. It's something that is hitting teachers as they enter as first-time teachers in districts that happen to have grants or strong leadership that's decided to implement this. So I think that's a real missed opportunity, and that we need to start developing some strong coursework in our teaching academies to ensure that the first-time teachers are learning about how to effectively manage classrooms for all students in personalized learning settings, but definitely for the differentiated and unique needs that students with disabilities have, is not just on day one, but in pre-service as well. So that can be through policy standards in the Higher Education Act, licensing standards in states. There's a lot of different ways to accomplish that.
So, as a former faculty member at an institution of higher education where I was part of the educator preparation program, let me start off by saying that the educator prep programs that I know and am familiar with don't necessarily do a very good job in preparing teachers who are not identified as heading into special needs to understand how to deal with students with special needs in the face-to-face classroom, let alone thinking about how to prepare future teachers to teach online and what that needs to mean to them. Having said that, there is so much in a 4-year curriculum that is already prescribed that finding a place to add that into the curriculum is virtually impossible. And I was teaching instructional technology, and I was having to fight to get instructional technology into the teacher preparation programs. So we've got an issue where this whole notion of preparing teachers in 4 years using a 4-year program is a problem just in our thinking and in our design, and we need to be looking at other models for our teacher preparation. Now, having said that, then when you're looking at teacher professional development, think about things a little different. Don't just think about courses. Think about mentoring. Think about learning coaches. There are other alternatives which have been shown to be very effective, require a different set of skills from the providers, but have been shown to be very effective. And then, and this is another hat, online teacher professional development. There are organizations that provide online teacher professional development, and this is one of the ways of getting that focused professional development that the individual needs, as opposed to bringing all the teachers together into the auditorium and having a wonderful dynamic speaker talk to them for an hour and a half, and then they go back to their classrooms.
Ray, and as a follow-up to that, there was one question about how it just seems very overwhelming to get started with the course design requirements and recommendations. And so other than downloading your report, how would you recommend that someone who's facing this for the first time get started with this process?
Okay, let me start off with the inappropriate comment that says none of this stuff is new and should have been going on from the beginning. Having said that, we all recognize that, you know, this is just starting to get to our awareness. So start off with the new courses. The course that you are going to be designing tomorrow, work to make that course accessible so that you're going to learn what to do and how to do it. And there are tools, and again, reference the publication, reference my other presentations on the blog, where I have like 14 pages of PowerPoint slides that have different tools and references. Recognize as a starting point that 1/4 of males have some form of color blindness. You should be thinking about color blindness as part of your color scheme. And so there are places that you can go, but take the course that you're working with today, that you're going to be working with tomorrow, and work to make that course accessible as possible. Learn from that one, and then apply that to your other courses.
Thank you, Ray. All right, well, we've had a lot of really great questions. I don't know if we can get to all of them, but let's try. So there was a question that came up during Meghan and Lindsay's presentation. I think it was inspired by the discussion about student engagement and student voice and choice in personalized learning, and how personalized learning has the potential to reduce the stigma of special education for students with disabilities. So the question was, how can we help students with disabilities build self-esteem? And just I would follow up to that question, how can greater student voice and choice that personalized learning enables contribute to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we definitely think this is one of the biggest places for opportunities that personalized learning offers. So NCLD recently conducted a study of 2,400 young adults with learning and attention issues. So these would be things like learning disabilities, reading, writing, math, and attention issues. And then asked them, looked at sort of the social emotional climate that they're working in, and looked at their confidence, and found dramatically lower levels of self-confidence among individuals with learning and attention issues than other peers their age. And so it's clear that there's a need to help them discover and use voice and choice. So we think that by the 4 systems that Maria initially put up, flexible learning paths, even the competency-based education, that one of the things that students with disabilities sorely need is an understanding of how to talk about their disability, how it impacts their learning, and what their strengths are. Too often with students with disabilities, we focus just on weakness and deficit, and we don't step back and say, what are they interested in? What are they really good at? Personalized learning has that sort of baked in. If you can find ways to amplify that for students with disabilities, help them clearly articulate how did they perform best on a particular assignment. What are the methods they're using? What are the accommodations? But what are the learning methods, the study skills they're using to achieve at high levels? That's going to build their confidence. It's one of the traditional things we work on with self-advocacy. The second and final thing I'll say, and we could go on and on about this, it's our favorite topic because it's such a need we need to fill. The second thing I'll say is, it's not just understanding what your strengths are, it's seeing having opportunities to use them. We know that our students with disabilities will go into college settings where they will be covered by the ADA, by Section 504. These are dramatically different laws. The law, ADA covers them in workplace as well. IDEA, which is covering them in the K-12 setting, the pre-K-12 setting actually, is full of rights and entitlements, and it's a wraparound kind of situation for students. We're trying to help them figure things out. They are going to have to come into other settings where they have to ask for what they need and tell people what they need. That's something personalized learning is already baked at doing. Flexible learning paths, learner profiles, all of these different instruments have a great potential for helping those students, and teachers need to give them opportunities where they can succeed, where they can fail too, but where they can learn how to ask for things and what they should be asking for. So overall, we feel like if you look at those systems, you can find a lot of ways to help them that will increase their self-confidence and their self-advocacy skills and really help their potential throughout their life.
So let me just jump in from the online perspective. When we started the online program at Virtual High School, we had students with IEPs, we had students with closed head injuries. We were using a scheduled asynchronous approach, and we had the students tell us that for many of them it was the first time they felt like they were a part of the class, that they were not special, that they were not different, because other students didn't know how long it took them to compose, to respond, to deal with things. So I think you also need to recognize that there can be benefits to having special needs students, especially even students with severe disabilities, including students with severe disabilities, to be in online learning situations.
Thank you. So there was a question that came in from, I think it was Mark Costin, and it was a long question, and I am going to try to paraphrase it and hopefully interpret it correctly, because I thought it was a very interesting one, which is a question about modified standards. Now, I believe under No Child Left Behind, states are allowed to assess students with severe cognitive disabilities, up to 1% of students in the state, under a modified standard. But I think Bart's question had to do with what happens when we're dealing with competencies that are aligned to the standards but are not the standards themselves, and how, to what extent can we modify those competencies and still make sure that students are getting access to a high quality education in the least restrictive environment. And so hopefully, Mark, I'm correctly interpreting your question, and I would invite any of our panelists to respond to that question.
Yeah, this is Lindsay, and so that's a great question. Just to be clear, exactly as you said, under No Child Left Behind in its current form right now, and in what we believe we'll see in the Every Child Counts Act, if that ever goes forward, up to 1% of total students can be taught to what we call alternate standards. I want to just make clear that we're talking about there's one set of alternate standards for our students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. There previously had been something called modified standards. Those have been eliminated by the Department of Education, and just finally about a week ago. So there are two standards that you are using to teach all students in our nation. For the 1% of your total student population with the most significant cognitive disabilities, those students might qualify for alternate standards. Remember that 1% of your total student population is about 10% of your students with disabilities. The rest of your whole population of students, whether they have a disability or not, is using your general standards, your age level, grade level standards. Now, what do you do if you're teaching a student who has a significant cognitive disability and is learning to the alternate standards? For alternate standards, you have to, if you're in a competency-based system, you also create the competencies to each of those standards that align to each of those standards. So, for example, in New Hampshire, where students are using their alternate standards, those are a different set of standards than our general standards, and they require a different set of competencies to be aligned to them.
Thank you, Lindsay, for tackling that question. Now, I'm afraid that we are actually out of time now. Let me just give you both, all three of you, a round of applause for really excellent presentations, as well as to our participants for some excellent questions. I wish we had more time to continue this discussion. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone that we are gearing up for the iNACOL Blended and Online Learning Symposium, November 8th through 11th in Orlando, Florida. And you can check out our blog for some preview of conference highlights. And also, we have some upcoming webinars tomorrow at 2 p.m. We have Back to School with NROC, fresh, no-cost resources for student success. And on September 17th at 6 p.m., we have our Teacher Talk webinar on Google Apps for Education. So with that, let me again say thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. And feel free to contact us here at iNACOL if you need any resources, any contact information. We'll be happy to hook you up with those things. So thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.